Chapter 10. The arrival of the floodwaters was heralded by great chunks of ice that came battering against the wooden bridge of grave dirt boxes, like like storm-born icebergs ramming anchored ships, ice shattering, wood splintering, a regular drumming that would beat out a warning, announcing the great wave that followed the outriding ice. Dead hands and living slaves scurried back along the coffin bridge. The dead's shadowy bodies losing shape as they ran, so they became like long, thick worms of black crepe, squirming and sliding over rocks and boxes, throwing human slaves aside without mercy, despite to escape the destruction that came roaring down the river. Sabriel, watching from the tower, felt the people die, convulsively swallowing as she sensed their last breaths gurgling, sucking water instead of air. Some of them, at least 2 pairs, had deliberately thrown themselves into the river, choosing a final death rather than risk eternal bondage. Most had been knocked, pushed, or simply scared aside by the dead. The wave front of the flood came swiftly after the ice, shouting as it came, a higher, fiercer roar than the deep bellows of the waterfall. Sabriel heard it for several seconds before it rounded the last bend of the river. Then suddenly it was almost upon her. A huge vertical wall of water with chunks of ice on its crest like marble battlements, and all the debris of 400 miles swilling about in its muddy body. It looked enormous, far taller than the island's walls, taller even than the tower where Sabriel stared, shocked at the power she had unleashed, a power she had hardly dreamed possible when she summoned it a night before. It had been a simple enough summoning. Mogget had taken her to the cellar and then down a winding, narrow stair that grew colder and colder as they descended. Finally, they reached a strange grotto where icicles hung and Sabriel's breath blew clouds of white. But it was no longer cold, or perhaps so cold she no longer felt it. A block of pure blue-white ice stood upon a stone pedestal, both livid with charter marks strange and beautiful. Then, following Mogget's instruction, she'd simply placed her hand on the ice and said, "Abhorsen pays her respect to the Clare and requests the gift of water." That was all. They'd gone back up the stairs, and sending locked the cellar door behind them, and another brought Sabriel a nightshirt and a cup of hot chocolate. But that simple ceremony had summoned something that seemed totally out of control. Sabriel watched the wave racing towards them, trying to calm herself, but her breath raced in and out as quickly as her stomach flipped over. Just as the wave hit, she screamed and ducked under the telescope. The whole tower shook, stones screeching as they moved, and for a moment even the sound of the waterfall was lost in a crack that sounded as if the island had been leveled by the first shock of the wave. But after a few seconds, the floor stopped shaking, and the crashing of the flood subsided to a controlled roar, like a shouting drunk made aware of company. Sabriel hauled herself up the tripod and opened her eyes. The walls had held, and though now the wave was past, The river still raged, a mere handspan before below the island's defenses, and was almost up to the tunnel's doors on either bank. There was no sign of the stepping stones and the coffin bridge, the dead, or any people. Just a wide, brown rushing torrent carrying debris of all descriptions. Trees, bushes, parts of buildings, livestock, chunks of ice. The flooded had claimed its tribute from every riverbank for hundreds of miles. Sabriel looked at this evidence of destruction and inwardly counted the number of villagers who had died on the grave boxes. Who knew how many other lives had been lost, our livelihoods threatened upstream. Part of her tries to rationalize her use of the flood, telling her that she had to do it in order to fight on against the dead. Another part said she had simply summoned the flood to save herself. Mogget had no time for such introspection, mourning, or pangs of responsibility. He left her watching, blank-eyed, for no more than a minute, before padding forward and delicately inserting his claws into Sabriel's slippered foot. "Ow! What did you—" "There's no time to waste sightseeing," Mogget said. "The sendings are readying the paper wing on the eastern wall, and your clothing and gear have been ready for at least half an hour." "I've got all—" Sabriel began. Then she remembered that her pack and skis lay at the bottom end of the entrance tunnel, probably as a pile of mordicant burned ash. "The sendings have got everything you'll need, and a few things you won't, knowing them. You can get dressed, pack up, and head off to Belisar." What is it? Hold on. Let me see. Hold on. Belisar. "I take it that you intend to go to Belisar?" "Yes," replied Sabriel shortly. She could detect a tone of smugness in Mogget's voice. "Do you know how to get there?" Sabriel was silent. Mogget already knew the answer was no, hence the smugness. "Do you have a map?" Sabriel shook her head, clenching her fist as she did so, resisting the urge to lean forward and spank Mogget, or perhaps give his tail a judicious tug. She had searched the study and asked several of the sendings, but the only map in the house seemed to be the star map in the tower. The map that Colonel Horace had told her about must still be with Abhorsen. With father, Sabriel thought, suddenly confused about their identities. If she was now Abhorsen, who was her father? Had he, too, once had a name that was lost in the responsibility of being Abhorsen? Everything that had seemed so certain and solid in her life a few days ago was crumbling. She didn't even know who she really was, and trouble seemed to beset her from all sides. Even a supposed servant of Abhorsen like Mogget seemed to provide more trouble than service. "Do you have anything positive to say? Anything that might actually help?" she snapped. Mogget yawned, showing his pink tongue that seemed to contain the very essence of scorn. "Well, yes, of course. I know the way. So I'd better come with you." "Come with me?" Sabriel asked, genuinely surprised. She unclenched her fists, bent down, and scratched between the cat's ears, till he ducked away. Someone has to look after you, Mogget added. At least till you've grown into a real Ebholson. Thank you, said Sabriel, I think. But I would still like a map. Since you know the country so well, would it be possible for you to I don't know, describe it? So I can make a sketch map or something? Mogget coughed, as if a hairball had suddenly lodged in his throat, and thrust to the back of his back a little. And thrust his head back a little. You? Draw a sketch map? If you must have one, I think it would be better if I undertook the cartography myself. Come down to the study and put out an inkwell and paper. As long as I get a usable map, I don't care who draws it, Sabriel remarked, as she went backwards down the ladder. She tilted her head back to watch how Mogget came down, but there was only a open trap door. A sarcastic meow under her feet announced that Mogget had once again managed to get between rooms without visible means of support. Ink and paper, the cat reminded her, jumping up onto the dragon desk. The thick paper, smooth side up. Don't bother with a quill. Sabriel followed Mogget's instructions and then watched as he resigned condensation that rapidly changed to surprise as the cat crouched by the square of paper, his strange shadow falling on it like a dark cloak thrown across sand, pink tongue out in concentration. Mogget seemed to think for a moment. Then one bright ivory claw shot out from a white pad. He delicately inserted the claw into the inkwell and began to draw. First a rough outline, in swift, bold strokes. Penning in of the major geographical features. Then the delicate process of aiding important sites, each named in finely spidery writing. Last of all, Mogget marked Abhorson's house with a small illustration, before leaning back to admire his handiwork and lick the ink from his paw. Sabriel waited a few seconds to be sure he was done, then cast drying sand over the paper, her eyes trying to absorb every detail, intent on learning the physical face of the old kingdom. You can look later, Mogget said after a few minutes, when his paw was clean. But Sabriel was still bent over the table, nose inches from the map. We're in a hurry. You'd better go get dressed for a start. Do try to be quick. I will, Sabriel smiled, still looking at the map. Thank you, Mogget. The Sending had laid out a great pile of clothes and equipment in Sabriel's room, and 4 of them were in the attendance to help her get everything on and organized. She had hardly stepped inside before they'd stripped her indoor dress and slippers off, and she'd only just managed to remove her own underclothes before the ghostly charter-traced hands tickled her sides. A few seconds later, she was suffering them anyway. As they pulled a thin, cotton-like undergarment over her head and a pair of baggy drawers up her legs. Next came a linen shirt, then a tunic of doeskin, and breeches of supple leather, reinforced with some sort of hard, segmented plates at thighs, knees, and shins. not to mention a heavily padded bottom, no doubt designed for riding. A brief respite followed, lulling Sabriel into thinking that might be it, but the sendings had merely been arranging the next layer for immediate fitting. Two of them pushed her arms into a long armored coat that buckled up at the sides, while the other two placed a pair of hobnailed boots and waited. The coat wasn't like anything Sabriel had ever worn before, including the mail hauberk she'd worn in fighting arts lessons at school. It was as long as the hauberk, with split skirts coming down to her knees and sleeves swallow-tailed at her wrists, but it seemed to be entirely made of tiny overlapping plates, much like a fish's scales. They weren't metal either, but some sort of a ceramic or even stone, much lighter than steel, but clearly very strong, as one sending demonstrated by cutting it down with a dagger, striking sparks without leaving a scratch. Sabriel thought the boots completed the ensemble, but as the laces were done up by one pair of sendings, the other pair were back in action. One raised what appeared to be a blue and silver striped turban, but Sabriel, pulling it down to just above her eyebrows, found it to be a cloth-wrapped helmet, made from the same material as the armor. The other sendings waved out a gleaming, deep blue surcoat, dusted with embroidered silver keys that reflected the light in all directions. It waved to the coat to and fro for a moment, and then whipped it over Sabriel's head and adjusted the drape with a practiced motion. Sabriel ran her hand over the silken expanse and discreetly tried to rip it in one corner, but, for all its apparent fragility, it wouldn't tear. Last of all came sword belt and bell bandolier. The sending brought them to her, but made no attempt to put them on. Sabriel adjusted them herself, carefully arranging bells and scabbard, feeling the familiar weight, bells across her breast and sword balanced at her hip. She turned to the mirror and looked at her reflection, both pleased and troubled by what she saw. She looked competent, professional, a traveler who could look after herself. At the same time, she looked less like someone called Sabriel and more like the abhorsen, capital letter and all. She would have looked longer, but the sendings tugged at her sleeve and directed her attention to the bed. A leather backpack lay open on it, and, as Sabriel watched, the sendings packed it with her remaining old clothes, including her father's oilskin, spare undergarments, tunic, and trousers, dried beef and biscuits, a water bottle, and several small leather pouches full of useful things, each of which were painstakingly opened and shown to her: telescope, sulfur matches, clockwork fire starter, medicinal herbs, fishing hooks and line, a sewing kit, and a host of other small essentials. The 3 books from the library and the map went into oilskin pouches and then into an outside pocket. Backpack on, Sabriel tried a few basic exercises and was relieved to find that her armor didn't restrict her too much, hardly at all, in fact, though the pack was not something she'd like to have on in a fight. She could even touch her toes, so she did, several times, before straightening up to thank the sendings. They were gone. Instead, there was Mogget, stalking mysteriously towards her from the middle of the room. "Well, I'm ready," Sabriel said. Mogget didn't answer, but sat at her feet and made a movement that looked very much like he was going to be sick. Sabriel recoiled, disgusted, then halted, as a small metallic object fell from Mogget's mouth and bounced on the floor. "Almost forgot," said Mogget. "You'll need this if I'm to come with you." "What is it?" asked Sabriel, bending down to pick up a ring, a small silver ring, with a ruby gripped between two silver claws that grew out of the band. "Old," replied Mogget. Son of a bitch. Enigmatically, I did it. You'll know if you need to use it. No, you'll know if you need to use it. Put it on. Sabriel looked at it closely, holding it between two fingers as she slanted it towards the light. It felt and looked quite ordinary. There were no charter marks on the stone or band. It seemed to have no emancipations or aura. She put it on. It felt cold as it slipped down her finger, then hot, and suddenly she was falling into infinity, into a void, into infinity, into a void that had no end and no beginning. Everything was gone, all light, all substance. Then charter marks suddenly exploded all around her, and she felt gripped by them, halting her headlong fall into nothing, accelerating her back up, back into her body, back to the world of life and death. "Free magic," Sabriel said, looking down at the ring gleaming in her finger. "Free magic, connected to the charter? I don't understand." "You'll know if you need to use it," Mogget repeated, almost as if it were a lesson to be learned by rote. Then, in his normal voice, "Don't worry about it till then. Come, the paper ring is ready."